My name is Addison Monroe, and for as long as I can remember, I was the family's invisible daughter. At 31, I've built a career that most people only dream of, architecting cybersecurity systems for major banks, yet I still carry the memory of sitting in a high school psychologist's office, clutching my knees, while my parents dismissed my feelings and lavished all their praise on my older brother, Marcus. He was the star athlete, the class president, the golden boy who got the shiny car at 16, while I got a hand-me-down sweater that smelled of mothballs. I left Seattle 5 years ago, determined to make my own way. I traded faded cedar shake siding and overgrown hedges for Manhattan's brick townhouses and bustling cafes. There, I found safety in lines of code and the unwavering respect of colleagues who saw me not as furniture, but as the expert who could untangle problems no one else understood. I poured every ounce of myself into my work, graduating top of my class on a full scholarship and landing a dream job before the ink dried on my diploma. Yet last October, a cousin I barely spoke to, Rebecca, called with an unexpected invitation to come home for Christmas. The word tasted foreign on my tongue. Home was the place that once told me I was encouraged to find steady work washing dishes, and laughed when I built my future instead. As I stared at the cracked plaster of my Brooklyn apartment wall, memories flooded back, the sting of being ignored, the thrill of rewriting reality through code, and the quiet promise I made to myself that this time I would return not as the unseen daughter, but as someone who knows her worth. When I think back to the moment my world shifted, I still see that dusty bulletin board in the corner of Maplewood High's main hallway. It was a cold Thursday afternoon, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead as students rushed past in their matching leather jackets and varsity hoodies. I, Addison Monroe, the quiet girl no one really noticed, had just slipped out of English class, my shoulders hunched against another day of feeling invisible at home and school. That's when I saw the flyer Computer Science Club, room 27, Thursdays after school. Something about those words stopped me in my tracks. I decided on a whim to slip into room 27 that very afternoon. The smell hit me first: dusty old PCs, solder fumes, and the faint tang of soldering iron. A dozen other students hunched over motherboards and tangled cables, their faces lit by the glow of CRT monitors. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. No one asked who I was. I simply slid into an empty seat, picked up a Phillips screwdriver, and started helping rebuild a broken hard drive. In that club, I learned to speak a new language, one of bits and bytes, algorithms and loops. We traded old textbooks on C++ and Python, argued about the merits of different compilers, and spent late evenings debugging each other's projects. We even salvaged discarded motherboards from the local electronics recycling center, fashioning them into working machines with duct tape and sheer determination. When my Windows 95 rig finally booted with its new power supply, the triumphant cheer echoed in that cramped classroom more loudly than any gymnasium rally. Mr. Alvarez, our teacher and fearless mentor, noticed early on that I had an instinct for problem-solving. One day he pulled me aside, his wire-rimmed glasses sliding to the tip of his nose. "Addison," he said gently, "you've got something special. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." His words felt like a lifeline, a stark contrast to the dismissive glances I'd spent years collecting from my own family, especially from my parents, who always praised my older brother, Marcus, while I was told to find steady work washing dishes. By the time I turned 17, I had a plan: apply to the top engineering programs in the country and leave Seattle behind for good. My portfolio of projects: an original platformer game coded in Java, a secure chat application built in Python, earned me a full scholarship to a prestigious New York Tech Institute, complete with housing and a modest stipend of $1,200 per month. I packed my thrift store sweaters and drove across the country in my battered Honda Civic, listening to NPR and mapping out the life I intended to build. College was a whirlwind of 18-hour coding sprints, caffeine-fueled hackathons, and late-night exams. I juggled a part-time cafe job on weekends, pouring lattes for weary students to stretch my stipend. But each waking moment was dedicated to mastering data structures, network security, and system architecture. When I graduated summa cum laude at 21, the offer letters from cybersecurity firms started rolling in. That first job in Brooklyn was everything I dreamed of: a back-end developer position at a firm specializing in protecting major banks' sensitive data. My team faced challenges that no one else could explain, but I thrived on dissecting complex issues and architecting elegant solutions. Within 4 years, I led a multi-million-dollar integration project for a global bank enough to buy my own brownstone condo in Fort Greene, complete with 2 bedrooms, an exposed brick kitchen, and a balcony overlooking the park. Looking back, it wasn't just about learning to code, it was about finding a community where my ideas mattered and my efforts were celebrated. The lines of code became my voice, and each successful compile was proof that I could build something real, something worthy of recognition. In that process, I discovered not only a career, but a sense of self-worth I'd never known before. Coding didn't just change my life. It showed me that the logic and structure I adored on screen could also bring clarity and purpose to my world. By the time Addison Monroe walked across that graduation stage, the applause felt nothing like the hollow cheers she'd heard from her family years before. She'd arrived in New York 5 years earlier on a full ride to the nation's top engineering program tuition, room and board, and AJ $1.200 monthly stipend, all covered by her academic merit. The day she unpacked her thrift store sweaters in a cramped dorm, she resolved that no one would ever again tell her she needed steady work. Instead, she poured every ounce of energy into mastering data structures, network protocols, and cybersecurity principles, often staying up until dawn debugging code while the rest of the campus slept. Weekend shifts at a local cafe kept her fridge stocked and her mind sharp, 1 part latte art, 2 parts intensive study sessions, yet it was her Saturday hackathons that became legendary. On any given weekend, you'd find Addison huddled beneath fluorescent library lights, trading notes on Python libraries and testing a secure chat application she'd designed to protect users' private messages. Classmates who once mistook her for quiet furniture learned to bring her their toughest challenges: how to thwart a simulated ransomware attack, how to integrate multi-factor authentication into legacy banking systems, or how to architect a server cluster that could withstand both traffic spikes and cyber espionage attempts. When she graduated summa cum laude at 21, job offers arrived in her inbox faster than she could read them. But Addison chose a back-end developer position at Skyline Cybersecurity, a boutique firm specializing in defending Fortune 500 banks against digital threats. Her first project, reinforcing the authentication framework for a major regional bank, required creating a security protocol from scratch. By autumn of her first year on the job, she had not only delivered on time, but had also reduced the bank's breach detection window by 60%, earning her a promotion and a bonus that paid more than her entire college stipend for 6 months. Never one to rest on accolades, Addison set her sights higher. Within 3 years, she was leading the integration of a multi-million-dollar security suite for a global financial institution. Her team, once skeptical of her youthful intensity, came to rely on her clear vision and steady leadership. They flew to London for initial deployment meetings and worked through New York nights to ensure seamless rollouts across Europe and Asia. When the project closed successfully, the bonus check in her bank account covered the down payment on a historic brownstone condo in Fort Greene. 2 bedrooms, exposed brick walls, and a balcony overlooking the playground where she used to sip coffee and rewrite her destiny. Yet for Addison, the real triumph wasn't the condo or the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows. It was the transformation in her own self-worth. She often reflected on the irony that the very skills she'd honed to protect other people's data had become the armor she needed to protect her dreams. The algorithms she once debugged in a dusty high school classroom had become her roadmap out of obscurity. Every successful code compile, every satisfied client, every well-earned bonus reminded her that she could build a life on her own terms without waiting for permission or validation from those who once dismissed her. Today, Addison mentors young women at her alma mater, sharing the story of that dusty bulletin board flyer and the computer club that changed her life. She speaks with seniors at community centers about the power of lifelong learning, using plain-spoken language and a warm smile to bridge generations. She measures success not by gas mileage in her Honda Civic, though she once drove 800 miles from Seattle to New York to chase her scholarship, but by the number of students she inspires to see themselves as architects of their own futures. In a world that often prizes connections over competence, Addison's journey stands as a testament to the quiet force of self-reliance. From a reluctant cafe barista to a systems architect in high demand, she carved her path through relentless curiosity, late-night code sessions, and unwavering belief in her own potential. And as she sips her morning coffee on that brownstone balcony, watching the city awaken below, she knows that no algorithm, no matter how elegant, could ever calculate the strength she found in choosing herself. When the phone rang that crisp October evening, I was curled up on my Brooklyn couch, nursing a mug of chamomile tea after a long day of debugging code. The number on the screen wasn't one I recognized: Seattle area code. Of all things. My heart skipped as I hesitated before swiping to answer. "Hello," I said, voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. "Addison." The voice was soft, Familiar. It took me a moment to place it. Eleanor, my cousin. We'd shared a bedroom at Aunt Nora's house when we were children, long before I'd retreated into silence and she'd drifted into her own life. I got your new number from my mom, she continued. She asked me to call. She said your parents want you home for Christmas. I froze, the steam from my tea fogging the cold window pane. My parents had spent the last 8 years acting as though I didn't exist, their chilly silences more telling than any harsh words. My brother, Marcus, had settled into the family's good graces so comfortably that I often wondered if I'd ever truly occupied a place in their hearts. And yet here was Eleanor, trembling on the other end of the line, extending an olive branch on their behalf. Home for Christmas, I repeated, tasting the words as if they were foreign currency. I pictured our old house in North Seattle, its weathered cedar siding faded by countless gray winters, the overgrown hedges brushing against the cracked walkway. I remembered the sting of family dinners where Marcus held court, charming everyone with his golden boy smile, while I sat in the shadows, polite and quiet, grateful for invisibility. Are they serious? I managed to ask. They sound serious, Eleanor said, clearing her throat. They're worried about you. I think they've realized how much they've missed having you around. Missed me? The thought was almost laughable, yet I felt a familiar tug in my chest, nostalgia mixed with apprehension. For months I'd immersed myself in lines of code and late-night brainstorming sessions, building a life in Brooklyn defined by my own achievements rather than their approval. I'd traded their dismissive remarks for colleagues' genuine respect, their lukewarm applause for standing ovations at hackathon finals. And now, out of the blue, they wanted me back. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, recalling the childhood appointment with Dr. Patel, the school psychologist who told my parents, Addison's pain isn't from isolation, it's from being ignored. My mother's dismissive scoff still echoed in my mind. We love both our children equally. That lie had shaped every awkward birthday, every awkward Christmas present, every moment I felt compelled to disappear. But Eleanor's voice reminded me that family could mean more than just those who never saw your worth. I know it's sudden, she said gently, but maybe this is a chance to make peace. Peace. The word tasted bittersweet. Could I walk back into that faded house and sit through another condescending toast from my father? Could I endure another night of whispered jabs about steady work and keeping family traditions? Or would I arrive as Addison Monroe, the self-made systems architect who bought her own brownstone, not as the invisible daughter they once urged to wash dishes at Aunt Nora's diner? Heat crept into my cheeks as I imagined unclipping my laptop, slipping on my tailored coat, and stepping into the winter night of North Seattle. I realized this invitation was less about reconciliation and more about them wanting a piece of the success they once ignored. Yet something in Eleanor's tone, a sincerity I hadn't heard in years, made me pause. Tell them I'll think about it, I said at last, my voice soft but firm. Of course, she replied, relief lifting her words. We all miss you, Addison. I hung up and stared at the silent city beyond my window. The skyline was studded with lights, each one a reminder of the life I'd built on my own terms. My parents' invitation dangled before me like an unfinished line of code full of potential, but also risk. Christmas was more than 2 months away. I had time to decide whether to return as the daughter they remembered, or to step back into that old house wearing my own hard-earned confidence. For now, I set my mug aside, opened a new document on my laptop, and began drafting an email that would mark the first step of whatever came next. The dining room smelled like roasting turkey and sage as I eased into the straight-back chair at precisely 7:30 p.m., the clock's long hand trembling over the 6. My parents, Robert and Diane Monroe, had spent the afternoon fussing over every detail, the hand-carved wooden table polished to a warm glow, the embroidered table runner stitched with autumn leaves, and the fine china arrayed as if for a magazine spread. At the head of the table, my older brother Marcus beamed, his crisp navy blazer and polished loafers a quiet announcement that he was the golden child once more. My heart pounded as Dad raised his crystal wine glass. To Marcus, he called out, voice ringing with pride, for your achievements at Stanford and the bright future you're building. Glasses chimed around me like church bells, smiles, warm and genuine for him. I lifted my own glass, my hand steady despite the churn in my chest, and offered a meek toast to Marcus. My voice was swallowed by the chorus of "Here, here." Then Mom's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. As for Addison, she said, nodding toward me and smoothing the napkin at my place setting, we're encouraging her to find something steady, maybe a part-time job until she figures out her path. Uncle Mike, who owned the diner on Elm Street, leaned forward, grinning. We're hiring dishwashers, he announced, patting his apron pocket for emphasis. Laughter erupted, full-bodied and unkind, and I felt each chuckle press against my ribs. But what they didn't realize was that I'd already secured a full scholarship to a top-ranked engineering program in New York, complete with tuition, room and board, and a $1,200 monthly stipend. I'd packed my thrift store sweaters into a battered Honda Civic 3 months earlier, driven 800 miles across the country, and moved into a crowded dorm room just steps away from Manhattan's subways. I'd graduated at the top of my class and landed my dream job before my family even knew what back-end integration meant. My mind flicked back to the day I opened that acceptance letter, how I'd stared at the sleek university seal, wondering whether I should wake my roommate to share the news. I'd kept it quiet until a quiet Sunday morning when I received a bonus check large enough to cover my first month's rent in Fort Greene. That check had bought more than a place to live. It had bought me the freedom to build something all my own. Now, as Aunt Nora passed the mashed potatoes around in generous scoops, I forced myself to join in the small talk, asking Marcus about his thesis on sustainable energy, inquiring whether he'd visited the new Stanford Research Lab. Each question felt like a calculated dance step, choreographed to maintain half-truths and conceal the life I'd built. When the turkey appeared golden, steaming, and thigh-deep in gravy, I carved a generous slice for myself, careful not to let my confidence show, but the real feast would come later, when Dad offered the usually harmless question, "So, Addison, what have you been up to these past few years?" He raised his eyebrows, hopeful and clipped. I met his gaze and, in the calmest tone I could muster, said, "I earned my degree in computer engineering, summa cum laude." A flicker of surprise crossed his face as I continued. "I developed an enterprise-grade security framework that was licensed by a major international bank. My bonus alone was $150,000 after taxes." Silence settled like pudding gone cold. Even the clinking of silverware paused. Mom's mouth formed a perfect O, and Marcus's fork hovered midway to his mouth. Then, one by one, their expressions shifted from confusion to something like admiration. I held their gazes steadily, letting the moment stretch. Dad cleared his throat and swallowed. "That's impressive," he managed, voice low. "How long have you been doing that?" "Since graduation," I replied, nodding once. "Every year my salary's grown, and the bonuses follow." Mom leaned forward, all sweetness and startled pride. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, voice trembling. I offered a small smile. "I was figuring out my own path," I said. "I wanted to prove to myself that I could." Dinner resumed with a different energy. Compliments replaced jabs, questions replaced jokes. Yet I saw the same old pattern trying to reassert itself, and I knew I wasn't there to entertain their newfound curiosity. I was there to demonstrate my worth to myself, as much as to them. By the time Aunt Nora brought out the apple pie, nearly everyone had offered congratulations, but I quietly sliced a piece, savoring the tart sweetness, and excused myself. I left behind the polished chairs and the half-hearted toasts, stepping into the crisp November air with my head held high. As I drove back to Brooklyn later that night, the city lights shimmered like a promise. I'd shown them who I was, and more importantly, I'd shown myself, whatever they said or remembered. No one could ever again make me feel invisible at that table. In that moment, I realized that the life I'd built on my own terms was all the validation I needed. 2 weeks before Christmas, I threw open the doors of my new Fort Greene brownstone for a modest housewarming that felt more like a celebration of survival than a milestone of material success. The exposed brick walls were still bare in places, and half the furniture arrived still wrapped in bubble wrap. But the laughter of my chosen family filled every dusty corner. We sat on floor cushions scavenged from thrift shops, passing around platters of takeout dumplings and steaming noodles from the neighborhood noodle shop, the savory steam rising like a toast to new beginnings. Lisa raised her glass, a plastic cup of cheap red wine, and grinned. "To Addison," she said, her voice warm and proud, "for turning a cardboard box life into a brownstone reality." We all clinked cups, and in that moment, I felt the weight of 8 years of silence lift from my shoulders. After dinner, we spilled onto the sidewalk under strings of holiday lights draped between the stoop columns. Sarah kicked at the leaves swirling around the curb and joked about how I'd once been terrified of raking them back in Seattle's yards. James, the architect friend who'd helped me hang my first picture frame, took a photo of our group messy cushions, half-unpacked boxes, and all, and captioned it, "Home is where you build it." I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and smiled, realizing that the home I'd built here had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with love and respect. That night, I I wrapped each gift by hand, a hardcover copy of a best-selling cybersecurity memoir for Lisa, a cozy cashmere scarf for Sarah to brave Brooklyn's winter, and a vintage chess set for James, who taught me strategy both on the board and in life. I tied each package with a ribbon in shades of forest green and deep burgundy, the perfect palette for a December trek back to North Seattle. On the flight the next morning, I watched the wingtip trace the sunrise as the temperature gauge read a brisk 45 degrees Fahrenheit. In my lap lay the neatly stacked gifts and an envelope from my parents. Marked, "Open only if you've learned to see me." My heart fluttered with anticipation and something sharper, a pinch of anxiety. The thought of returning to the faded cedar siding of my childhood home, with its overgrown hedges and flickering porch light, felt like stepping onto the stage of a play I'd long since left. The 6-hour drive alone gave me time to rehearse how I'd greet them. Would I be Addison Monroe, the self-made systems architect with a brownstone in Brooklyn, or would they still see me as the little girl they encouraged to wash dishes at Uncle Mike's diner as Interstate 5 stretched before me? I cranked the heat to a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit and let my mind replay every possible scenario. I reminded myself that this trip wasn't to ask for approval or pity, it was to show them who I'd become without them. By the time I rolled into North Seattle, dusk had settled over the quiet streets. The houses looked smaller in the winter light, and I pulled onto the cracked driveway with a confident calm I hadn't felt in years. I grabbed the parcel of gifts and the envelope, squared my shoulders, and braved the cold. The porch light flickered on as I rang the bell, and I took a slow breath of the crisp air scented with pine and damp earth. Mom opened the door first, her wool coat draped awkwardly over her shoulders. "Addison," she said, surprise softening into a tentative smile. Dad's eyes followed behind her, and I saw that old mixture of pride and disbelief. I stepped forward, handing over the wrapped gifts. "Merry Christmas," I said simply. In that moment, I felt the solid certainty of every choice I'd made to get here, every late-night code sprint, every cross-country mile, every dollar saved, whether they recognized it or not. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was Addison Monroe, and I had come home on my own terms. When I stumbled upon that bright red flyer taped to the bulletin board at Lincoln High one chilly October afternoon, I had no idea it would change everything. My name is Addison Monroe, and at 17, I was more accustomed to feeling invisible than celebrated, especially at home, where my parents reserved all their praise for my older brother, Marcus. But the moment I read Computer Science Club, room 27, Thursdays after school, something inside me stirred, on a whim. I left my English class, tracing the worn hallway tiles until I reached the door marked 27. Inside, I discovered a small army of students hunched over dusty desktop towers, their faces illuminated by the glow of green-on-black code. The room smelled of solder, old circuit boards, and possibility. Without a word, I stepped to an empty workbench, picked up a Phillips screwdriver, and dove into a dismantled hard drive. To my surprise, no one asked who I was or why I'd shown up. Everyone was too absorbed in their own quests to rebuild obsolete PCs into working machines. In those Thursday sessions, I learned more than just programming syntax. I found a community that valued logic, creativity, and persistence above all else. We traded worn textbooks on C++ and Java, stayed late debugging each other's programs, and scavenged spare parts from a local electronics recycling bin. When the lab's ancient Dell finally booted, cheers erupted louder than any pep rally crowd I'd ever heard in the gym. For the first time, I felt seen not as furniture at the dinner table, but as someone with a skill that mattered. Mr. Alvarez, our computer science teacher, became my fiercest advocate. One rainy afternoon, he pulled me aside, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and said, "Addison, you've got a rare talent. Promise me you won't let anyone, least of all your family, diminish what you're capable of." His words echoed in my mind long after I left that classroom. They became my mantra during long nights of coding and weekend hackathons, where I pitched my first secure chat application to skeptical classmates and fine-tuned its encryption algorithms until it ran flawlessly. By senior year, I had a clear plan: apply to top engineering programs, earn a scholarship, and leave Seattle behind. My portfolio, complete with a Java-based platformer game and a Python script that automated data backups, earned me a full ride to the New York Institute of Technology. The scholarship covered tuition, room and board in a dormitory just blocks from the subway, and AGJ $1.200 monthly stipend, which I stretched by working weekend shifts at a local cafe, serving lattes to bleary-eyed students before morning lectures. College was an exhilarating blur of 18-hour coding sprints, caffeine-fueled study groups, and summer internships with cutting-edge cybersecurity firms. I graduated summa cum laude at 21, with job offers from coast to coast. But the greatest triumph was realizing that every late-night line of code, every packet sniffed, and every bug fixed had built more than technical expertise. It had built my self-confidence. That dusty bulletin board flyer had done more than introduce me to computer science. It had introduced me to my own potential. It taught me that belonging isn't about blood ties or birth order, but about finding a place where your contributions are valued and your voice is heard. Today, as a lead systems architect designing security frameworks for Fortune 500 clients, I often think back to Room 27 and the moment I chose to walk through its door. In that decision, I discovered not only the language of computers, but the language of my own worth, and that story is the foundation of everything I've built since.